Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple of data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. As always, Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, is with us in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, before we get to our data points, I wanted to remind listeners about two live shows we have coming up next month. The first is in Washington, D.C. That is on Tuesday, September 17th. It's at the 6th and I venue. In-person tickets, but also VIP and virtual tickets are all available now at sixthandI.org. And then, 1 week later, on Wednesday, September 25th, we are coming to New York City. We will be at Caveat on the Lower East Side. Tickets for both those events are in our show notes. We, of course, hope to see you there. It should be fun. Okay, we have two data points for you today. The second will be about the state of Minnesota. That's on the occasion of the selection of Tim Walz, the governor of that state, as Kamala Harris's vice president. But our first data point is $18 billion. That is the amount of money that Google paid Apple in 2021 to become the default search engine on Apple's Safari internet browser. Those payments were at the center of a landmark decision that was issued recently by Judge Amit Mehta in the U.S. District Court of the District of Columbia, in which it was declared that Google had abused its monopoly over the search business.
We use it every day, of course. Now the government is considering breaking up the platform over accusations it has monopolized online searches. This stems from a federal judge's recent ruling that Google has an illegal monopoly.
In a landmark case in the United States, a federal judge has found Google guilty of U.S. antitrust violations. It's a staggering defeat for the tech company that could upend decades of dominance and potentially reshape how millions of Americans get their information online.
It was the first time that Google has been declared a monopoly of this kind, but not the first time that a tech company based in the U.S. has. Yeah, the economic implications could be vast, or they might not be. That's what we thought we would try to unpack. So, Adam, just to start right off, does anything specific now change as a result of this ruling against Google? In past years, Microsoft has been declared a monopolist in European courts, but that has hardly, changed the company's standing, it seems, or even seemingly many of its practices, and it can, I guess, afford fines that have been issued against it. So yeah, it seems like legal judgments are one thing, but the, application of these judicial rulings to businesses seems to be another in the case of Microsoft. So should we expect now this to be any different when it comes to Google?
That's a great question. The way this works procedurally in the US is that they now start a separate set of hearings, a trial, if you like, to decide the remedies. And that will be in September. So there's this break now while we wait. And of course, Google will appeal. But this initial finding is just the beginning of a process which could go on for years. What's clear, I think, is it's really bad news for Google. This isn't a slap on the wrist. It's a real blow. I think the real question is whether it's, basically a slap across the face or something, a blow to the body that will really change the company fundamentally. I mean, the ruling is very unflattering in ways in which it gets into the nitty-gritty of the business, the abuse of attorney-client privilege, systematic erasing of chat flows. Google shares sold off 5% immediately. I mean, at stake is 70% of 77% actually of Google's revenue is in the advertising stream. So this is a big deal, and it will set the stage also for the raft of other cases which are being brought through the courts against big tech. It's really a comprehensive list. So there's a suit by the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, and 17 states against Amazon, which is going to go to trial in October 26. There's a case brought by the DOJ in 15 states against Apple for blocking non-Apple approved apps. There's a separate DOJ case against Google for bullying advertisers. And then in December 2020, back then, the FTC sued Meta for acquiring Instagram and WhatsApp and trying to block down social media competition. And the Google ruling, I think, will, give tailwind to all of those cases. The tricky question is not so much, I think, in the first instance, the sort of brute question of power, But, in other words, can American courts impose? Because they've done drastic things. They broke up Bell Labs. They created the modern AT&T system. They can do drastic things. The question is what to do. And the problem really is that everyone recognizes, and Judge Mehta is not some sort of dinosaur. The guy's in his early 50s. He knows, like everyone else knows, that Google is the best search engine. And that's our problem, right? And everyone, including all of Google's partners, they would never enter into this if they didn't know that they were providing their customers with a superior service. That's the deal. So deep down, the real question is, did anti-competitive practice contribute to Google establishing itself in this position? And is there anything that could be done to now remedy that so as to create conditions for somebody else to come along and build a search engine that's at least as good? And the American courts and the American jurisprudence distinguishes between different ways in which you can do this. The most radical or seemingly radical would be structural remedies, where you would break the business up. So this is what they did do to Bell in the 1980s. And you force the company to split itself up. The problem with this is that the likely outcome of that would be that you then have two separate companies, say a digital advertising firm and a search engine firm. And who would they end up having to do contracts with? Well, they'd probably end up having to do contracts with each other, because maybe other digital advertisers might come along that might then muscle in on the bargain rather than the in-house Google stuff. But the search engine would remain dominant. And the judgment actually acknowledges that the most popular search term on Bing, which is Microsoft's alternative, is google.com. So, if you're stuck outside the Google ecosystem, people just want back in. For this reason, I think the European experience has been basically insubstantial. So I think what's very likely is that the judgment will rule out the most offensive item, which is basically this revenue sharing deal between Google and its privileged partners, the likes of Apple, Samsung, and whatever, that put Google at the center of their entire businesses in exchange for money. Now, of course, they don't want to lose that revenue stream. So there will have to be some redesign of those contracts, which makes them less evidently uncompetitive. I think the real acid test of whether they're getting radical is really about sharing data. The courts don't like doing this because they're complicated deals to do. They would, in some senses, prefer to break the company up and say, problem solved, we did a structural breakdown. But if you actually wanted to disrupt Google's business, what you would require them to do is to publicly expose the search data from which they derive their actual power, their actual efficacy. The problem with that, of course, from a privacy point of view, is horrendous. And so there's huge limitations on how far you actually want the company to be sharing literally billions of people's online browsing habits. But if you were serious about trying to shift the balance of power in this sector, that's what you would be talking about. You'd be talking about various types of firewalled, anonymized mechanisms for enabling other people to train their algorithms to do the search job as well as Google does it currently. And that, I think, is really where the nub will be. One suggestion would be some sort of oversight body that permanently reviewed. And American law cases can have this kind of effect where you establish it's almost like a sort of, supervised divorce where you have a mediator that continuously monitors the way in which an agreement is being implemented. That would be, I think, a very interesting move towards a kind of judicial politicization of big data where it really matters. It's certainly not going to solve a problem. And of course, the reality is that we live in a world transformed very much for the better by many of these tools. So we don't want to destroy or abolish them. But I think shifting the political terms is a hugely significant move. And I do think of it as an expansion of democratic power and oversight by means of one of the fundamental branches of our, of any liberal constitution, the judicial branch.
Yeah, I do wonder in that sense whether then the ruling is significant primarily for what it reveals about U.S. politics right now, namely that both Republicans and Democrats seem to support a shift towards a new approach to antitrust questions. Specifically a more European approach, with this focus in this ruling on how the monopoly position is reducing innovation rather than just sort of the consumer experience. Is this really a kind of shift in U.S. politics, and does that matter?
This was a very fascinating aspect of digging into this a little bit, because, it came as a real surprise to me because there's been so much dirt dished against Lina Khan, the head of the FTC, who's like this hotshot young lawyer. Interestingly, also from a South Asian American background. And, the head of the company that they're suing is likewise. It's really a fascinating powerhouse of South Asian American intelligence being brought to bear on these fundamental problems. Anyway,
the main competitor. It's also worth saying the main competitor, Microsoft, is also led by South Asian, and the judge is of South Asian. It's like quite across the board.
It's really fascinating, really an incredibly interesting development in America's social history and political history. I mean, there's been so much dirt dished against her, and so much talk about neo-Brandeisianism and hipster antitrust. And so to discover that this case was brought under the Trump period, and in fact the case against Meta as well, it really kind of scrambled my coordinates a bit. Because, as you say, there's also been a big conversation about the way in which the Europeans were moving much more aggressively on this. There was a set of arguments about the perverse and malign influence of the Chicago School of Law and Economics, and by contrast, European ordo-liberalism and its focus on market functioning, appeared like a solid rock of competition and accountability. I mean, at Columbia, for heaven's sakes, we hosted Max Schrems, the Austrian activist who brought cases against Facebook and Google. I mean, he's a star, he's a superstar. We had loads of people in the audience. But I do wonder a little bit whether we aren't, in a sense, overthinking this, or in just indulging our desire to tell, interesting, fascinating intellectual history stories about a very brute reality, right? Which is that over the last 20 years, these gigantic corporations, which are now the most valuable businesses in the world, have not just accumulated huge wealth, but they've transformed everyone's lives. Google is a verb. Everyone can remember the first time you realized, I can anyway, I'm old enough. Like, I typed words into this thing and all of a sudden it produced this search result. It was staggering. And I was a fairly, tech savvy person in the 80s and 90s. It was this extraordinary experience. And the position of power they've established is vast. And at some point, it doesn't take rocket science. The penny's got to drop. I mean, Google has a 90% share of the online search market and a 95% share of the smartphone. Like, it's a monopoly, right? So I guess you could say it's testament at least to the fact that even in America's radically polarized political environment, which, as we know, even basic indicators of economic well-being can be viewed from very different angles depending on the time of day and the balance of parties and political forces, at least in this respect, we can all kind of agree that, Your Honor, it kind of looks like a monopoly, it sniffs like, it smells like, and it's got 90% of the market. Sir, I think it's actually a monopoly. Like, I think we need to do something about this. We got there, So now collectively the question is, what do we do next?
Yeah, I guess finally, I just wanted to ask, whether this is a ruling ultimately that's about yesterday's technology, in a sense. I mean, isn't AI rather than web search the current technological frontier, as we've been discussing for months, if not years at this point? And does then this ruling itself actually reveal something about how, even in the best circumstances, in the most promising set of political and judicial circumstances, regulation necessarily always falls behind? That basically the workings of administration ultimately can't keep up with innovation in the economy. Is there something to that?
I mean, that's kind of tempting. It seems maybe I thought maybe that was a little unfair at first, but then the more I think about it, I mean, I don't think Google's being convicted of doing anything that we wouldn't have recognized as monopolistic practice, well before there were search engines. If there's a company which essentially forms a cabal with its closest partners to exclude others and then cuts them in on the profits it's making, I think it's fairly obviously anti-competitive practice, though obviously the domain it's doing it in is radically new. I think it's true, of course, that complex legal cases in rule of law countries, especially ones where, it's a kind of contest between two sides and they both ramp up and arm up to engage in a kind of legal arms race, are going to be slow and protracted. And I don't really think we'd want it any other way. But I think another way of putting this would be to say that it's so important that these big tech cases are coming now, precisely because there isn't really much reason to think that the AI revolution is not really going to compound this problem. In other words, it's crucial that we start pushing back now. It's late in the day, but better late than never. It's important that we start pushing back now because we might be about to enter an era in which the dominance is even larger. Now, that's not the only way of thinking of AI. Ironically, there was this memo that was circulated within Google itself last year in the summer, which had the title, "We Have No Moat," I think it was called. So that's the Warren Buffett phrase about investing in companies that have moats, because then, like robber barons, you can sit there and exert your privilege and power from within a defense. And the argument was that with AI, that would break down. And that's the optimist scenario about what might happen here, which is that AI feeding on itself will enable relatively small players to, in smart ways, run rings around the giant lumbering language models which the big players are building. And then you point to the space of apps and podcasts and all of the extraordinary sort of fertility and productivity and creativity that's been unleashed in the new tech economy over the last 10 to 15 years and say, well, that's the way we're going to go. It seems to me to be a relatively naive vision, because the whole point of the current struggles is that relatively fecund, diversified ecosystem had always power structures in it like big money and the Pentagon and so on, and it has produced an extraordinarily oligopolistic, not to say monopolistic structure. And everything really in the AI space seems to be pointing in that direction. You know, Google did Maps and then cloud computing and email, Gmail and web browsers and YouTube, and now it's got Gemini, which is its AI offering. And the really big beast is OpenAI, and that started out as its name suggests, a sort of not-for-profit open structure. Then it was pushed in a more for-profit direction in 2019, and now I think it's clear that Microsoft, after having made a $10 billion investment with 49% of the shares, and being the dominant player in that ecosystem, is asserting its power. And so to that extent, the AI revolution, insofar as we're actually going to see one, may be, as it like, a kind of reshuffling of the pack between the giants of the new big tech world. So, you know, it may be a win for Microsoft over Google, or a win for both of them over Meta or whatever. But it's not a fundamental cracking open of that structure. Far from it. In fact, it's a giant accelerator of that concentration, because the models exhibit economies of scale. At least they seem to exhibit economies of scale. So that benefits those who can make these huge investments to build and train them. And NVIDIA itself, a monopolist, just goes, you know, laughingly to the bank every single day, pulling down the giant orders for the ultra high performing specialized chips which are necessary to drive these systems. So it maybe adds a player, it reshuffles the pack within that group. But if anything, it compounds their existing massive advantages, which means that the old fashioned standard cases that need to be brought need to be pushed, so that when, you know, a promising AI upstart like Anthropic, which is operating on a smaller scale than OpenAI, does its web service deal, it gets good terms when it negotiates with Microsoft, or in its case, I think it's negotiated with Amazon, such that the terms of those deals are relatively equitable. The devil will be in the detail. The AI revolution doesn't look like it's going to disrupt the power structure, but it may open the possibility. It certainly increases the stakes in defining what the power balance within that structure of tech and financial power is going to be, and how government relates to that through all the branches, through the legislature, the executive branch, and the judiciary, is going to be crucial in shaping the future. And to that extent, I think the problem isn't simply that tech, you know, we're slow to respond to tech. I think the American government, state apparatus, and it's not alone in this, is slow to respond to power aggregation in general. And this would be a particularly important case of that. But when there's a win, we should celebrate the win. And this is a win. This is at least a questioning of the structures, at least calling something what it clearly is, calling a monopolistic position, opening up the space for a serious conversation and debate and struggle, because that's what it will take, legal and other types of struggle, to shift the terms here. Should one be super optimistic about that? Why would you be super optimistic about that? Does it produce like technological change? Yes. Are we the better off, in my view, for having all of these big tech operators? Undoubtedly, from the point of view of the expansion of human knowledge and its frontiers. But does it have a political economy? Is it unequal? Does it produce huge advantage for certain people? Does it shift the power? Will it ultimately also be part of a geopolitical contest? Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I will admit, maybe when I was thinking about this power balance in the U.S., I was probably also had in mind the sort of cringeworthy sort of congressional hearings where you have the CEOs come to Capitol Hill and somewhat clueless questions from legislators, some of whom are, themselves very elderly, and forcing the CEOs to respond. And, I can't help but think that Congress seems sort of behind the ball on these questions. But yeah, that's not to say that other branches of government, whether the executive branch or the judicial branch, can have a little more dispatch and effectiveness.
I've been to dinners in New York with senior big tech people who have quite openly spoken about the fact that they are profoundly concerned. They're not even talking about Congress. Everyone knows. I mean, congressional hearings about any topic tend to be embarrassing. But they're seriously concerned about the level of technical knowledge inside the judiciary and inside the executive branch. And not as an accusation, not as some sort of slapdash accusation against government in general, but because they know perfectly well how hard they run all the time to keep up with the technological developments. They know what kind of incentives they can offer for people inside that world. They get rich, right, by being expert. And public service, generally speaking, can't offer those benefits or doesn't currently offer those benefits. And there is a structural problem here of how to empower the public bodies, the public discourse to respond to this challenge. It's a really profound challenge. And AI, of course, because it eats into the problem of our brains and how they work, just compounds this problem, because they literally are at this point in a monetized way trying to industrialize, if you like, the thinking process. Yeah, we there's no easy solution for that. And this too is a generic problem, right? It was a huge topic of debate within the financial regulation sphere, and folks like me got into the history of 2008 in part because it seemed crucial to upgrade public layperson's knowledge about what's going on. I've been super into vol and vol of vol this week because listening to all the the techiest podcasts I can find so as to try and understand what happened, so that we could do the podcast and I can write newsletter and so on about it. But that is, I think, a crucial challenge for democracy, for the question of power in general. And it extends also to areas of, say, and this is, foreign policy's mission, to thinking about geopolitics and defense strategy and national security issues. There too, there are these knowledge asymmetries. But when one of those asymmetries gets very, very extreme and moves very, very fast, as has been the case with tech, yeah, it poses really profound political questions. And I was very struck, by the way, in the people inside the business were super conscious of this and were saying it's quite alarming that there is so little joint expertise when you're running something like a giant map or a giant database or AI or this search engine. Like, I need to be able to interact with and seek guidance from folks on the other side, on the regulator side, who are as knowledgeable enough to help me think these things through. And in finance, to a degree, we have that because we have the circular door, the revolving door between finance and the Fed bureaucracy in particular, and the regulators to a degree, and the big law offices. And so that's where you get that kind of circulation of elite expertise. And we need more of that in the tech sphere.
Yeah, I suppose we'll see how this case goes forward and how that's revealed as a kind of test case as well with Google. But yeah, we will leave the conversation here for now, maybe return to it at some point, but we'll be back first to talk about the economics of Minnesota. Welcome back. The next data point is 6. That is the ranking of Minnesota in the list drawn up by CNBC of America's top states for business in 2024. That's a statistic that Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, has been very fond of citing. Walz, of course, is the selection for vice president by the Democratic Party nominee, Kamala Harris, in this year's presidential election in the United States. Walz has been governor for the past 6 years of Minnesota and has been quickly castigated by Republicans as a progressive, a dangerous liberal who could threaten the U.S. economy if he takes office as vice president. Yeah, we thought we'd unpack not just Walz's record, but the broader economy of Minnesota. And we thought this could actually be a good way to start an intermittent series in the weeks ahead on America's swing states and the economy of those various swing states. Those economies are each distinct in their own way. And we thought we'd kind of check in on them one by one as we get closer to the election. But we'll start with Minnesota. And Adam, specifically, Minnesota is a state that's known in the United States for having been largely settled by German migrants, but not only German migrants, specifically Scandinavian migrants. And I'm curious, how that's affected the culture of the state and its economy.
Yeah, well, Walz himself is an example of this. His family actually hails from Nebraska, but his paternal side, I think, is from Baden, Germany, southwest Germany. And then he has Scandinavian ancestry as well, and Irish, and then moved within the Plains states from Nebraska to Minnesota. Minnesota's not a densely populated place. It only has a population of 5 million today. So when you look at the map of the continental US, one of the really distorting things that happens is you see these giant, expansive states and imagine that lots of people live there, and they don't. And Minnesota is by no means the smallest. We should say, not just as a matter of form, but a very significant fact, of course, is that Minnesota wasn't first settled by white people. It was first settled by Dakota and Ojibwe Native American cultures and populations. And still today, Minneapolis is the third largest and one of the most diverse urban American Indian populations. Of the 5 million Minnesotans today, about 1% are Native American. The Dakota were largely driven out after the bloody US Dakota War of 1862. So that opened the door to mass settlement of the rural areas, which began already in the 1830s with the construction of the Erie Canal. The problem with the deep interior of the US is how do you get there? And so the river crossings and steamboats was one way, which creates the city of Minneapolis-St. Paul. And then the other is the railway, which comes to Minnesota in the 1860s. And that's really when you get this huge surge of German and Scandinavian migration. Prior to that, it was largely Yankee. And so, yes, you get this very powerful formation of German speaking, and it's a mixture of Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish settlement. The traces of that, especially on the German side, which were the largest group in quantitative terms, are raised by the nativism of World War I, which makes it, politically unpopular to be German. I mean, it's no doubt true that there is this large influx, but it's very mixed, and it's driven by the economy. So originally agrarian, then there's a lot of lumber, wood felling, and then there's mining. And the mining communities are astonishingly mixed of the so-called iron areas of Minnesota. And, they include perhaps Minnesota's most famous native until recently, who was Bob Dylan, who comes from a Jewish family that migrated from Ukraine to the mining areas of Minnesota. His album, if you think about it, The Times Are Changing, the early 60s classic, is really a kind of piece of Minnesota country blues. It's also about the decline of the iron areas in Minnesota. And then Minneapolis itself has a very distinctively kind of rough-edged, tough legend almost. It was a notoriously lawless city through the late 19th century. Even into the 20th century, some of the worst and most dangerous gangsters of the Prohibition era, like Machine Gun Kelly and John Dillinger, kind of fled to Minnesota because it was so poorly policed and they could kind of hang out there. And then, of course, most recently, Minneapolis is the scene of the killing of George Floyd by a police department that was found to be, like many, big city police departments in the US, riven with racism, a combination of racial and class prejudice against poor black men, essentially hustlers, trying to make a living in one way or the other. So this is a state with a kind of an identity that's built around a kind of late phase European white migration, but actually is a very diverse place, which has resonated in American politics and culture through the martyred figure of George Floyd and through, a cultural icon like Bob Dylan.
Interesting, yeah. I mean, if we were to just sort of peel off the politics of Minnesota and look at that more specifically, I mean, it does seem that Minnesota has a fairly distinct tradition of political liberalism. I mean, on some basic level, the state is associated with a lot of pretty well-known progressive political leaders over the years. I mean, Walz is now being sort of put in that category, but before him, Senator Al Franken, Paul Wellstone, Walter Mondale, former vice president, Hubert Humphrey. I mean, just sort of various names that stand for political liberalism. And the Democratic Party in the state of Minnesota is not even called the Democratic Party, technically. They're called the Minnesota Democratic Farmer Labor Party. And so I'm curious, what differentiates Minnesota's liberalism from, the kind of Democratic Party liberalism that's found elsewhere in the U.S.?
Yeah, Minnesota's a really interesting case in this respect as well, because, if you look at American politics, the central question which people ask themselves again and again and again is, why are we stuck with these two parties? And the modern Republican Party comes out of this same zone of the plain states of the US. The abolitionist tradition was strong. That's the anti-slavery tradition was very strong in these areas. The free labor tradition was incredibly powerful. But for the rest of time, we've been stuck with this choice between the Democrats and the Republicans. And the question is always, couldn't there be a third party? And couldn't that third party be, well, if you had to name it in sociological terms in the late 19th, early 20th century, you would say, well, why can't it be a party of farmers and workers? And if you look at the political history of Sweden, or for that matter, Germany, the question of whether you could form a coalition between farmers and workers was indeed the central question of democracy in the 20th century. And in the German case, it failed until the Federal Republic period after 1945, where you began to get workable relations between different communities across confessional divides, Catholic, Protestant, North, South, and so on. But in Sweden, the secret of the success of Sweden's famous social democratic experiment is precisely a coalition between farmers and workers. And the American West becomes a zone of experimentation along these lines. There was, in fact, a National Farmer Labor Party that was formed in 1918. It runs a candidate for the presidency. It's a failure. But in Minnesota, the Farmer Labor Party is the dominant political force in much of the state throughout the 1920s, 1930s, and it's then merged with the Democratic Party in the New Deal era. So when the Democratic Party, if you like, absorbs the politics of this, what in the British case would be called a Lib-Lab alliance. So a merger between small businesses, which are the farmers, and unionized workers. It's when the Democratic Party, through its own DNA, through the progressivism of the New Deal era, absorbs that the party remerges with the Democratic Party, and Minnesota converges with the politics of the rest of the US. But de facto, you could argue that this is the question about the Democratic Party at various times. It's like, where is organized labor, and to what extent is it an independent force? And in Minnesota, for a time, it was an independent force. And to what extent is it incorporated into the main body of the Democratic Party? So Minnesota becomes a big driver of civil rights politics in the US after 45, and it's one of the states with the highest rate of unionization still to present day. I think the unionization rate's in the teens, like 16, 17%. So it is not Swedish social democracy in the American Midwest, but there are traces and there are structural similarities here in the politics of this state to the sort of configurations that we're more familiar with in other places in the world.
Yeah, got it. And I suppose it is worth saying that this alliance, hasn't held up in the present day as much as it had earlier in the 20th century. I think the Trump Republicans of peeling off much of Minnesota's rural areas. But the name still stands, and I guess some of the tradition still stands with the Democratic Party in Minnesota. I mean, to get to the economy of the state today, if you were to think about Minnesota, and I guess people who are a bit informed about the state, there are two big corporations that come to mind when thinking about Minnesota. Target, the big retailer, and 3M, which is a company that many people may not know, but they probably know its products, namely among them Post-its. So Target and 3M. I'm curious, between those two companies, what kind of distinguishes them? First of all, Target, its main competitor is Walmart. But what distinguishes Target from that other big retailer that's spread across America? And as far as 3M goes, if you kind of look at that company, it refers to itself as a major tech company, which I was sort of surprised by because I'm mostly associated with adhesives like Post-its. So yeah, what makes 3M a tech company if it is in fact one?
Yeah, if you look at the list of the biggest companies in Minnesota, it's really striking because it's a really powerful demonstration of the way in which, on the one hand, sort of natural forces, the resources of the state, the agriculture, the mineral resources, and on the other hand, the intervention of government and the military-industrial complex shape modern America's political economy. So amongst the biggest corporations in the state are agricultural ag businesses. So Cargill, the giant commodities dealer, is there. General Mills is there. Land O'Lakes, if you buy butter in America. So these are all companies which are closely associated with Minnesota. 3M comes out of that same line because what they were originally set up as, the 3Ms comes from the fact that they were the Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company, so 3Ms, is they were in the abrasives business. And they were in the abrasives business because of the lumber business in Minnesota. And so they're in surface treatments, if you like. That's their thing. And they invented Scotch tape, so the most popular higher end brand of sellotape in the United States. So they did sandpaper first. They revolutionized sandpaper. Why does that matter? Because it's the surface finishing you do for all lumber, but also crucially for the auto industry. So if you're going to polish, if you're going to put high gloss finishes on modern motor cars, mass production coming out of Michigan, right? You need sandpaper in huge quantities, abrasives, so as to be able to shine metal. So they make a huge business out of abrasives. Then they get into adhesives. Then they become a supplier of surface coatings of various types to the tech business. And tech is this hub of companies that are formed in Minnesota during the World War II period, really. So you have 5 firms. You have Engineering Research Associates, Univac, Honeywell, Control Data, and IBM Rochester. Now, most of those are now no longer in the foreground of tech, but in the 40s and 50s and 60s, this was a major Minnesotan tech hub. And ironically, it's out of that the Target brand then comes, because Target is servicing and providing big box retail for the affluent white-collar employees of this rapidly growing tech center in Minnesota. And then Target actually becomes one of the early adopters of digitally controlled stock and inventory management. And in 1962, both Target and Walmart opened their first stores, along with they're this weird combination of suburban department stores at a low price point. So they have the sort of some of the trappings of glossy big department stores in big cities, but they're catering to a more price conscious consumer in suburban settings. The story of the two is that Walmart becomes the biggest retailer in the world by a huge margin. Its turnover is about 20 times that of Target. It has 5 times as many stores in the United States. It's a much bigger business. But Target has sort of developed a distinctive brand profile, which is quite nicely summarized in the quip on its name, which apparently began to circulate almost immediately, which is that people refer to it by a Frenchified pronunciation, which they call it Target. And so, whereas Walmart is the genuinely budget-conscious option, Target is what you might say the slightly stressed, younger professional consumer will prefer to have Target items. I have a couple of things I remember shopping in big box world, and you would choose to go to Target because it has a slightly a higher gloss feeling. But they're both incredibly tightly managed icons, progenitors of the modern big box business. In the case of Target, grown out of this post-war tech-based affluence, which 3M in its own way was also feeding with this focus on, really highly sophisticated surface coatings of different types. They used to do floppy disks, things like this. And it's a very research-intensive business, apparently. You wouldn't think it, but they invest heavily in these key, it'd be like what the Germans would call the hidden champion, but it's not Mittelstand. 3M is huge, but it's that kind of a business.
Interesting, yeah. One of those companies that we don't talk about all so much, but yeah, is definitely huge, and certainly in the state of Minnesota. Yeah, I guess I wanted to zoom out a little bit here, because for all these economic strengths, Minnesota is not a place that is rapidly growing in the U.S. particularly. I mean, generally, when you track population growth, the areas that are often referred to as growing fastest are in the U.S. Sun Belt, in the South and the Southwest. That's where populations are growing fastest. And I'm curious whether Minnesota, which is known for its cold weather in the winter, whether we should think of cold weather generally as an economic impediment, especially, in a kind of age of mobility. Is cold weather just a kind of obstacle these days, and will that continue to be the case?
Yeah, it's, I think, an important point to make for folks from outside the US in particular. It's taken for granted in the US, but it's important to note, which is that population growth is a key driver of economic dynamism in the US. And the movement of populations and the overall increase in the American population is a key driver of the fact that its GDP, when you don't adjust it for population per capita, grows more rapidly than, say, Japan's or European economies do. And so within the US, whether or not you're a rapidly expanding Sunbelt state, like a state like Texas or California, or a state like Minnesota, whose population has not expanded very dramatically in recent decades, is a highly significant thing. It's obviously the result of a range of really complex factors to do with housing costs, education of the population, structure of the underlying economy and how it's changing. Whether I think is a factor in the Minnesotan case. But it doesn't seem to affect, I think, the long-run growth so much as the size of, above all, the tourism sector. And it kind of cuts in two different ways. I mean, Minnesota, like much of America, has a continental weather, so it's very cold in the winter, but also sometimes very sunny and often quite hot in the summer. Hence the agricultural importance of these areas. And so there is a large seasonal fluctuation in Minnesotan employment. And a big business in winter sports, but large-scale employment in vacation holidaying in the summer. And the reporting on weather that you see in relation to Minnesota is less to do with cold, as in fact the problem that global warming is reducing the winter season in Minnesota and threatens winter seasonal employment there. So rather than, as it were, extreme cold being the problem, the big concern, because that's something that Minnesota has obviously lived with. It may, with the advent of air conditioning over the last half century, have been possible to shift populations. But previously, extreme cold was not really seen as an impediment. I think extreme heat was a bigger issue for the South. But the big worry now, I think, is that climate change could undercut the winter tourist business.
Yeah, so then finally, I guess I want to return to Tim Walz himself and his record as governor in Minnesota. As I mentioned, the Republicans are depicting Walz as a far left liberal. And yeah, there was a fair amount of progressive legislation passed in the last couple of years under Tim Walz, including free school lunches for kids is often cited, but also protections for abortion rights, among other legislation. And yeah, I'm curious how Walz went about this. I mean, Walz, like Joe Biden in Washington, he had a narrow Democratic majority in his legislature. And yet, he was able to pass seemingly a more sweeping progressive agenda. So, yeah, what distinguished how Walz was able to pursue his political agenda compared to Biden?
Yeah, I mean, I take your point. I think I somewhat resist the fact that we're framing this through the crazed, distorting lens of GOP, attacks. Like, yeah, Walz is an unapologetic progressive, and he's been very forthright, refreshingly forthright about it. And yes, the Minnesota Democrats have passed a raft of legislation, but if you look at it, enshrining abortion rights, establishing paid family leave, restoring the voting rights of felons, extending voting access, $1 billion into affordable housing, some kind of background check on the sale of firearms, creating a refuge program for trans people. I mean, sure, it's progressive politics, but only in the eyes of a kind of cynical conservatism would you paint this as radicalism in any sense, right? So it's just basically modernizing social democratic politics of a type that people in Europe will take for granted being implemented in America, which makes it this kind of radical thing. Why are they able to do this on these tiny majorities? I think it's a really interesting question. And there was a great article in New York Magazine about this that I know we both read and with profit. I mean, I think the argument made there is that the crucial dynamics are within the Democratic Party majority. So what in the end hamstrung the Biden administration was the fact that they had Sinema and Manchin notionally inside the Democratic Party, but that were basically conservatives. And these two votes, given their wafer-thin majority, meant that it was very, very difficult to do anything at all. And the IRA only passed by the skin of its teeth, and it's not what it was supposed to be, right? And that is not the logic as it played out in Minnesota. So they have a wafer-thin majority, but what's happened is because of the, if you like, the polarization between what's known as the Iron Range, the old industrial areas of iron mining, and the rural areas, which have gone strongly Republican, and the big city liberals. The folks who were elected in the larger cities of Minnesota have moved to the center and to the left. And so the coalition, if you like, has displayed not the self-blockading tendencies of the congressional majority in Washington, but this sort of self-radicalizing tendency. And then they also had a lot of money to play with. So they inherited a large budget surplus, and they've chosen to use that creatively and proactively. And so I think it's these two elements of a party that, in a sense, came together around an agenda rather than tearing itself apart, that had resources to work with. And also, I think the phrase apparently that circulates in the Minnesota Democratic Party is that that you might only govern once. So a kind of a lack of complacency, a sense that the theory of change essentially is do the right things, do the progressive things, make these structural changes that will benefit Minnesotan society, and build and widen the coalition on the basis not of compromising on your agenda, but on a policy of thoroughgoing reform. Back that up and try and win on that basis. And that, I think, is the gamble and the wager, and why so many people around the country will be watching the Minnesota results, not just the presidential, but what's called the down ticket results, very closely, because this is, by American standards, one of the most consistent and coherent programs of reform anywhere in the country.
Yeah, this is all fascinating stuff, Adam. There's a lot more I could ask. In fact, I would be remiss not to ask you if there's anything to be said about the economics of the musician Prince, who famously came from Minnesota and resided in Minneapolis for most of his life. So, yeah, anything you can add here about Prince and Minnesota?
Well, I think the fascinating thing about him, looking at his biography, is that he is clearly part of the migration of Black folks from the South under Jim Crow to the North, right? He's born in 1958 in Minneapolis, but all four of his grandparents are from Louisiana. His great aunt was a Black nationalist who established the peace movement of Ethiopia. So Prince is really a representative, I think, of this much more mixed cultural heritage of this state than is painted by the simple picture of Scandinavian and German settler farmers who create this lovely community of European is sort of self-sufficient and high-functioning and high productivity economics. I mean, Prince is part of a much more checkered history of the state, much more diverse. And it was lovely to see the governor and other folks in Minnesota politics recognizing him. I mean, certainly between Dylan and George Floyd, he must be the most significant cultural icon to come out of the state, and much missed. I mean, truly extraordinary figure.
I'll just add here for listeners, Adam and I often discuss the topics we want to address beforehand, but this last answer was genuinely ad-libbed here by Adam. So thanks for that last answer on Prince, because, we definitely didn't want to forget him. I won't ask about Husker Du or the Replacements or other Minnesota bands here, but we got to Dylan and Prince, so we'll leave it there. We'll see other swing states in the weeks ahead, so stay tuned for those. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Twos homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @onesandtwospod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.